In a world where we want to beat the other side, realize really there isn't another side. There's just people you haven't connected with.
I'm completely in awe of Tiernan. Everything that he said in that conversation was just gold.
The great thing about civil partnership and marriage campaigns is the winning continues every single day. Someone's getting married. I will not be invited to that wedding. Thank God. I mean, imagine.
My boring things about me is actually about you. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
I feel strangely proud.
Welcome to the Being Human podcast with Amelia and Jez Francis. Brought to you by Just Add Water.
Hi, I'm Amelia Vegting.
And I'm Jez Francis, and welcome to the Being Human podcast, where with special guests, we continue to explore what it means to be human in this world we find ourselves living in. So, Amelia, the football last night, semi-finals, did you enjoy it?
I did enjoy it very much. I was very conflicted going in because, as you know, I'm half English, half Dutch. But I suppose I was lucky that I was actually always going to have one of my nations in the final.
Oh, I hadn't thought of it like that. Yeah, very good point. It made me think of Owen Eastwood, a close friend of ours at Just Add Water, and an amazing guest from Series 1 of our podcast, and all the work he's done with Gareth Southgate and the entire England setup, working on creating togetherness and belonging and belief. I'm convinced that this has helped them cope with the judgment that they all face and the criticism, that they get online and in the press and from the pundits. It's a real testament to the work that he's done with them, I think.
Speaking of previous guests, you and I are just back from 2 weeks of really enjoyable work, delivering workshops to leaders from, one of our new clients on the power of storytelling, where we used concepts that we talked about with the wonderful Lisa Cron.
Yeah, look, it was a great couple of weeks on the road, which reminds me I've got a really good boring thing about me to tell you about.
Hold that thought for now. I think we'll come back to boring things about me a little later on once we've spoken to our brilliant guest on today's subject, which is campaigning, which does feel particularly fitting given that 2024 seems to be the big year for elections, all around the world.
Indeed, we've recently had our general election here in the UK, like other countries in Europe, and there are also elections, some of which have already taken place and some coming up across Africa, South America and Asia, and of course in the US later this year.
Choosing a government is one of the obvious areas, I think, for campaigning, but it isn't, the only one, whether it's for raising awareness, fundraising, advocacy, education. Campaigning is really about, I think is really about changing the way that people, think, feel and behave.
Yeah, what I'm really curious about is how you measure the success of a campaign. I'm not sure it's just about the numbers counted at the end of a vote. It feels to me that it's just as much about connecting with people, hearing their needs, and the art of persuasion.
I think we should leave it to our campaigning expert to give his insights and wisdom, and hopefully can help answer your questions.
Let's introduce Tiernan Brady to the Being Human podcast. Tiernan is the Global Director of Inclusion at Clifford Chance. He was Director of the Equality Campaign, the successful Australian Marriage Equality Campaign, and the Political Director of Yes Equality, the successful Irish Campaign for Marriage Equality, the first two countries to enact marriage equality by public vote. He was the Policy Director of Glen, the Irish LGBT+ NGO, the Director of Organisation to Irish Deputy Prime Minister Mary Coughlan, and Mayor of his hometown of Bundoran in Ireland. So from mayor to campaign manager to human rights advocate and activist, Tiernan's proven how a willingness to understand and meet others where they're at and to help them see change through their values rather than trying to compete with their worldview can drive lasting change. Tiernan, welcome to the Being Human podcast.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for joining us. And just to kick us off into the conversation, as we do with most of our guests, we'd love to ask you a few questions to get to know you a little bit more, if that's okay.
Oh, okay.
Don't look so nervous.
Okay, so first question for you. If you could go to a concert with any three people, dead or alive, who would they be and why?
Actually, do you know what? This is the hard part. I actually just love my friends. And I have a long list of friends. Okay, now I'm going to go for a wander. You're not getting a short answer, but I'll be quintessentially Irish. Because this is actually connected to campaigning. I think one of the most joyful things you can have is have friends who have different opinions. And there was a group of us actually in Ireland. We would meet every Thursday, long before the Irish referendum, even before we were doing political strategy on civil partnership. And we still meet regularly, but we meet very regularly when I was living in Ireland. And I think between the six of us, none of us voted for the same political party. We would crack through all sorts of topics, but it was because we had different viewpoints, but we were prepared to enjoy discussing, disagreeing, and having great fun about that. You also, I mean, first of all, sometimes you change your mind, which it turns out isn't a crime, but sometimes you might feel like it's a crime at the minute. But also you sharpen your own beliefs and your own ability to understand why you believe in something. So actually, my friends is my short answer rather than a whole pile of famous people, because I'd be listening to the music anyway. So, you know, I don't want them distracting me.
Tiernan, what's a hobby or an interest that you have that might surprise some people?
Oh, I tear through hobbies and then discard them.
Yeah.
I am going to learn Outer Mongolian and then that goes in the bin. Or I love playing the piano when no one's looking, and it has to be when no one's looking because it is inconsistent quality. But I do enjoy doing it, and I always used to enjoy. I mean, don't get a chance to do it in London anymore. I used to enjoy doing amateur dramatics, like local plays and pantomimes.
Oh, fun.
In our hometown of Bundoran, we used to do like the local pantomime, which was just outrageous. You know, probably wouldn't pass any form of political correct scripting now when you think about it, but it was all good fun.
They bring people together, don't they, in such a wonderful way.
Yeah, I think we missed that sometimes. Pantomimes and plays were great for bringing people together in the winter when it was all cold and boring. Watching 100 channels, you actually worked with your community and created something. I'm not going to say brilliant because that wasn't always brilliant. Sometimes it was rapidly car crashy, but it was always entertaining.
The amateur and the things going wrong make it more real. It's more real life and therefore more relatable.
Yeah, I think there's just such a pressure on people for everything to be perfect now and everything to be spot on. And that misses the joy of error. I mean, I know we'll get to that even as part of this conversation about how do we talk about change and how do you create change. But, you know, if everything has to be perfect before you start, first of all, no one can start. And secondly, it'd be very dull. I mean, I can't imagine anything less interesting than an evening of wine with a perfect human being. I can't just be so excruciatingly boring. No offense to any perfect human being is listening to this today, and good luck to you.
So if you could instantly master any new skill, ones you might have on your list coming up, what would that be?
I'll play the piano. That is the original one. That is a good question. I love languages, and what I would love is confidence in languages. I like my French. I have very basic Latin. Good Irish, but not enough opportunity to use it. And I think one of the challenges I'd love isn't so much to learn new languages, is to be confident when I'm speaking other languages. Because I think, again, funnily enough, and this wasn't meant to be the theme of being scared of error, it's interesting how your French gets better after one glass of wine. And I've always thought that because your inhibitions disappear, actually the inhibitions stop us being really good at things we probably are really good at. But we don't want to stumble or make a mistake or look imperfect. So I would like to lose my inhibitions about speaking the languages that I have learned.
I think there's something really interesting about speaking other languages, which is where do you sit between kind of trying to be perfect and also just making yourself understood? And actually, the glass of wine thing I think is interesting because you forget about being perfect and you realise that actually you are in a conversation and you're communicating and exploring stuff, and that's what matters.
I used to love when I sat on we used to go to meetings of the council off in Donegal, Northwest Ireland, and you would watch councillors who were like obviously 100% bilingual, but they would start their speech in English, and depending on how emotional they felt into it, they would just slip into Irish without knowing it. But only if you felt strongly about it. Because I think your personality changes with language too, depending on what language you're speaking. So, but it was always magical to watch too. The ability to just hop in and out of something. I think there's something really interesting about wanting to learn other languages. In fairness, for people who live in England and in Ireland and in Australia or Canada or wherever, you know, we speak a language that is phenomenally dominant in the world of media and in the world of diplomacy, and that means we can sometimes miss the joy of learning a second language because we think we can scrape by without it. We're missing something when we don't.
And I think it also that relates to your world as well. Sort of speaking through someone else's language perhaps gives you an opportunity to see the world in a different way as well, you know, in terms of broadening one's perspective.
And you learn something about how you communicate. When I went to Australia first, I remember doing some speeches, and you don't realize how fast you speak in your own language. So I had this fabulous wee fella beside me in Melbourne at one of the events, and he was doing the sign language, and I think I nearly killed him. So I think we had to just kind of go, okay, now I'm going to pace myself. I've learned something about how to communicate now, a little bit more thorough. I was actually, my partner's from China and Australia via China. And we went to a wedding in Cork, and it was a friend of mine who was a politician, and he was marrying his husband, thankfully, and it was a big Cork political wedding down in the southwest of Ireland. One was a teacher, one was a senator. They were both very Gaeilgeoirí. They were supporters of the Irish language, but they were great talkers too. But also they have a very distinct accent down that part of the world. So we were sitting at this wedding, and of course the speech went on. Honestly, the speech went on for about 3 hours, but at one stage, Wayne, my partner, leaned over to me as they were in full flight in the speech, and he said, I know they do a lot of Irish here, and it's really great. I wonder, will they get to, will there be an English speech soon? To which I had to reply, no, this one is in English. My partner had perfect English, but it turns out people from Cork may not. So...
What's a quote or a mantra that you live by, Tiernan?
It's a really good question. I mean, you could make them up as you go along. There's a few that I always use at work and in the campaigns. So a value you keep in your head as a secret is an important one, which is, could be a lot of people who just think being great is good enough. But no, you have to be actively great. People have to be able to see that. So I like that one, and I use it a lot. Only your mother knows you're awesome. And we talk about this at work a lot because, I would like to think most people are awesome, but they kind of presume that everybody will see it. And you kind of no, only your mother knows you're awesome. You have to show it to everybody else. And one of the ones we used a lot, to be honest, was you don't have to be an expert to be an advocate. I think the world we were in with campaigning is sometimes makes people feel they need to know everything before they can open their mouth on anything. And that's such a bad journey, because the vast majority of people who support a minority right today almost certainly didn't support it 10 years ago. So we had to allow them to have conversations about that. I think you don't have to be an expert to be an advocate is one I like telling our own people, and telling people, even in the Australian campaign and the Irish campaign, about you have to meet people where they are. There was a wonderful campaign we ran in Ireland. Well, I don't call it wonderful. In the middle of the marriage campaign, which was called I'm Voting Yes, Ask Me Why. And I stole it from Scotland. It was during the independence referendum in Scotland. And whatever people's opinion on the independence referendum, you're watching it to see good ideas, because referendums are wild animals. They're hard to win. And BBC News was doing a piece from Inverness, and there was a woman standing on the side of the road with a T-shirt. First of all, she was in Inverness. God love her. I mean, she was fearless standing in a T-shirt in Inverness. But she had made a homemade sign just out of cardboard and crayon. And I said, I'm voting yes, ask me why. And I remember thinking what a great, unwittingly brilliant analysis of how to create space for conversation. That they had identified, instead of talking at people, you had to create space to invite people in. And I remember just thinking, that's brilliant. And we stole it and turned it into an entire campaign around Ireland, from a handmade one-off slogan that somebody wrote on the side of the road in Inverness. I have no idea who the woman was. I'd love to meet her someday. But it was just that concept of, give people a break. We all started somewhere, and we have to allow them to find their way towards us. And we can't just do that by folding our arms and expecting people to just rock up and demanding it. So I wandered off on you, but there's three or four great slogans there. I mean, about how do we campaign in a way that isn't obsessed with explaining to people why they're terrible. Because when we do it that way, they don't listen.
Yeah.
Or how they're wrong. You start from a place of telling people that they're wrong. You can pretty much guarantee what the outcome's going to be.
Completely turned off.
Well, we know that. I mean, we sit down with Granny and explain to her why she's a homophobe, and you're wondering why Granny then just nods but doesn't become a supporter. I mean, I think that's a really important piece of it. Sometimes we think that the journey, and now we've wandered totally, sorry.
No, keep going.
We're journey to change. And I think we got this right at the beginning in Ireland, and we kept it here, that in some way you can only improve if, first of all, you have some kind of public moment where you acknowledge you're terrible. And speaking as an Irish Catholic, I've always found it as well, though, there's an element of religiosity about that tone that I feel uncomfortable with. The idea that you must repent publicly before you can become acknowledged as a good person. So I have to explain to Granny why she's a homophobic bigot before I can persuade her to vote for equal marriage. And it's such a bad framing. And you're problematizing people. And you're explaining to people why they're the problem. And funnily enough, when we start our conversations by explaining to someone what's wrong, the first thing you do is defend yourself.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you? And feel defensive. And Granny, after being told she's a bigot, doesn't, nobody clutches their pearls and goes, well, thank you for telling me how awful I am. I support you for the rest of my life. Nobody does that. But we campaign like that a lot. And I think one of the real challenges for people who are trying to create inclusion campaigns now is the world incentivizes that campaigning. So you're incentivized through social media platforms.
Yeah.
The more shrill you are, the more polarized you are, the more followers you get, the more interaction you get from the polarized on the other side, which in turn you can monetize, as well as the social media platform managing to monetize it. And of course, the media does the exact same. We defaultly blame social media. I think we should, but it's poisonous. But at the same time, we do the same with media, because media all too often treats discussion on topics like entertainment and wants to compete with "I'm a celebrity, get me out of here." So having a big fight with fireworks is more entertaining than having a discussion about difference and nuance. And so the space for all of this is disappearing. The space for campaigning is disappearing. And we're leaning into this idea that the enunciation and the explanation of why you're the problem is the essential part of beginning the journey. And if you think about a lot of inclusion training, if you think about a lot of campaigns in the world out there, we are obsessed with explaining to people why they're a bad idea. And we miss the point that they don't have to listen to us, and that we're a minority, right? And we want to get them over the line. And I always thought there's a really basic premise for any campaign: build your own coalition, not the other side's. And that sounds really obvious to me. But when you think about the framing of a lot of campaigns and a lot of inclusion training, we're actually doing the opposite. We're explaining to people, first of all, why they're on the other side. We're literally starting the conversation by placing them in the opposing coalition. This is really bad tactics for engaging someone and asking them to make a journey. Surely the first thing you should be trying to do is getting them to see how connected they are to you and how much, we're right beside each other. So let's make this journey together, or you're a great idea, be part of that change. And the world is really squeezing that type of campaigning out. But, for underrepresented groups, it's where we win, because we're trying to get people to become advocates. And we know we can do it, but I don't think it starts by explaining to someone, here, Granny, let me tell you why you're a terrible old homophobic bigot.
Thank you for sharing some of those personal insights into you. I think we know you a little better now, which is great. Take us back to the beginning, please, Tiernan, if you wouldn't mind, and tell us a bit about where you're from and what life was like for you growing up as a young person.
I grew up I was born on one side of the border in Ireland, and I grew up on the other and went to school on the other. So I spent most of my time growing up in a conflict zone. I'm crossing the border of that conflict zone twice a day, which is interesting. I mean, I think there's always a couple of things when you grow up frame you at, and they're not always dystopian. Like everyone goes, it's not that kind of journey. I walked to school on my bare feet and with a bag of coal on my back. I most certainly did not. But we grew up in a fantastic community that was, so interconnected and so supportive. But we grew up in a conflict zone where difference was something that led to death and led to pain. And I think that frames a lot of us and how we think about engaging and how change can happen, and how dangerous building a world where we just pitch our tents and shout at each other is, where it inevitably leads to. So I certainly think that was one part of my early growing up. And I think for most people who grew up on the border or anywhere in that conflict zone or any conflict zone, I think obviously it has a huge legacy impact, because you're aware of what can go wrong. and the price that people can pay for that. And I also grew up in a tourist town, which is Bundoran, surf capital of the world. I'm just saying, anybody who wants to go. I always thought there was something really interesting about growing up in a tourist town, because you grew up in a world where difference was regular. So people from all over the world pass through your town, which isn't what most towns' experiences were in the 80s. We get a lot more travel now, but even for most towns in the world, you don't have that flow of difference. I've always thought there's something very nerdy and interesting about the impact of growing up in a tourist town on people's perspectives of the world. So I think that background is an eclectic mix of rural and conflict and Ireland. And it was rural Ireland. Like it was, I'm sure a lot of people have watched Derry Girls. Derry Girls is my favorite documentary because that's the world I grew up in and the time zone I was at that age in. So it was both a time of conflict, but it was also a time of change. But also you were growing up in a world that was really still very socially conservative on both sides of the divide. The competition was to see which side would be more conservative. It was not the other way around. It was so, and you grew up certainly as a young gay man. And it's so easy to say now, you had no real concept of what it was because there was no reference point.
Yeah.
And there was deliberately no reference point. It was something that, was based on the idea that if we just don't talk about it, then it doesn't exist, which of course we know is nonsense and phenomenally damaging to human beings. But you grew up without that reference point, and then you kind of learned in bits and bobs as you went. And of course, you're also growing up in the northwest of Ireland, which meant you weren't the only gay in the village, but you thought you might be. So that being gay was a theoretical condition rather than a practical one. So it was a real mix of. I thought that diversity of tourist, the experience of being a gay person in what was a phenomenally conservative place, a place where you were invisible, and a conflict zone, and it is certainly an eclectic mix. But at the same time, again, there's a very dystopian backward lens. We go, oh, must have been horrendous living in the 1990s in Ireland. And you go, no, it wasn't. I ran for mayor in 1999 in my hometown. And I can remember when I ran, of course, the other side will do what other sides do in all campaigns. They will talk about what's wrong with you or what they think might be your weak points. And that could be you're fat, you're tall, you're thin, you're too old for the job, you're a Protestant, you're a Muslim, you're a Catholic, you're gay. And of course, that one came up on the doorsteps. And of course, so that was said about me. And this is a time when decriminalization was only about 4 years old. And I got elected on my first attempt, even though people are in this so-called very conservative part of the world, well, they had been campaigned to with this, oh, you can't vote for the gay guy, don't vote for the gay guy. And they ignored that.
What was it that inspired you to stand and to campaign in the first place?
We came from a politically interested family in general. And so that always frames you, to be honest, not necessarily not a family of politicians, but a family of politically interested people. So it was always of interest to me. And I hadn't actually expected to run for it, to be honest. I had gone to Dublin, I had done my degree, and I had planned to stay in Dublin where being gay wasn't a theoretical condition. And I ended up being home by chance due to other circumstances. And I was approached, and then I started to think about it. So I got this approach to run, and at this time I was 23, and I really thought about it long and hard. And actually, I have to say, local government was one of the most rewarding jobs I ever had, because it's one of those beautiful jobs where you can have an idea, you can propose the idea, you can deliver the idea, and see it.
Yeah.
So think, take a playground, for example. You think about national politics. Sometimes you're so far away from the impact, you don't get that joy. So I actually really loved doing it. And I done 2 terms at it. And again, I thought was very interesting about local government was, you don't have that kind of national political pressure to be partisan. So people were willing to work together. Obviously, you have your annual day where the chairs are elected of the committees and you all get into your camp. And that's what politics is. But on a day-to-day basis, it wasn't. And I found that really a formative piece of learning actually for the other campaigns we did about you're not trying to beat the other side, but there's a difference.
Just as you're talking about that, campaigns and activism are all about influencing the decisions of others. So how do you go about identifying the core issues and goals for a campaign?
Well, but I think a lot of people miss that question, first of all. I think I think one of the first most important things you can do with a campaign is go, okay, define your goal? What is your win? A lot of people are in campaigns, and it turns out they have a whole different set of definitions of winning. So, and they don't realize it because nobody ever stepped back and went, okay, what are we working towards here? So some people will be working on a campaign to deliver equal marriage, and some people will be working on it as a stepping stone to dismantle patriarchy, and some people will be working on it because they want to beat the other side. And I think they're perhaps the most worrying part. I think understanding social change campaigns as slightly different than political campaigns. And so as a basic commencing principle, bear with me on this. A political campaign requires a winner and a loser. It's really important when you think about it. If there was an election tomorrow and everybody won, that would be nonsensical.
Yeah.
And if everybody was in government, that would, not be sustainable. So we allow the fact that the pendulum will swing back and forth. In fact, it's a healthy part of political campaigning. You beat the other side gets another chance 3 years later or 4 years later to beat you, and you have to deliver or else you risk being beaten. So the very nature of political campaign requires a healthy pendulum to go back and forth. A social change campaign, a pendulum is a disaster. We don't want social progress to swing back and forth wildly. We want to be able to build sustainable growth and sustainable journeys so that people can bed down new
beliefs,
improvements in dignity and status and standing. It's really important. But all too often we confuse these two types of political campaigns at the very beginning to the question. We think we have to run social change campaigns like political campaigns. And we have people who confuse beating the other side with winning. And I always argue that your starting point in a social change campaign is understanding that winning is not the same thing as beating the other side. Because for social change campaigns, we have to position ourselves that we're in the business of persuading everybody. It doesn't mean we will persuade everybody, but it has to be our default. And because we know this. Look, if we had a marriage equality referendum in Australia 15 years before I was there, we would have lost. 15 years later, we had it and we won by a really great margin, 63%. Fantastic result. But that's a short space of time. That means the majority of people who probably voted yes were the same people who would have voted no if we'd asked them 15 years earlier.
Yeah.
If you're running campaigns that understand that your goal, first of all, is how you approach persuasion and change. So that you're agreeing on, we want to get from A to D, but we recognize that today's advocates may have been yesterday's opponents, and that today's opponents may be tomorrow's advocates. And that's the campaign we want to build, because we're not there to beat the other side. We're not there to get 50% plus one vote, because that's unsustainable for minority rights and the quality of minority experiences. So, and I don't know, I hope that kind of answers your question of that. I know
it does, absolutely.
Yeah.
Get your goal, but also radically get your approach right. In a world where we want to beat the other side, realize really there isn't another side. There's just people you haven't connected with.
Yeah, that us versus them just is a really conflicting approach that you see everywhere, and it's causing such rifts between people and such a stubbornness to even be open to a different idea.
Because especially add to that, if you're a minority representing, let's say, anywhere between 5 and 10% of the population, if you want to run an us versus them campaign, you're insane. And I mean, people look at the marriage referendums, but I always don't think about the marriage referendums necessarily as an LGBT moment. Think of them as a minority moment, where a majority in the ballot box supported a minority experience. And that's very rare. There's nothing inevitable about that. You look at Australia, they passed marriage by 62%, but then there was an Indigenous rights referendum last year, and it got crushed by 62%. So the same people, again, so how you engage, how you persuade, how you campaign really matters. You can't take anybody for granted. But it also reminds you minority rights are hard to win, and therefore you have to think very carefully and strategically about how you win them. You have a duty of care to your people.
Tell us a bit about the approach you took then in Australia and some of the challenges you faced in designing and coming up with the approach that you then put into practice for the campaign.
You really have to embed new thinking into your support base to start with. So we've done a lot of travel talking about this first point. Winning isn't the same as beating anybody. What we're trying to do is persuade people in a world where that's not fashionable. So first point is, really building your base's understanding. Treat your base and your support seriously and engage with them respectfully and go, this is why we're approaching it this way. Take them on their journey. I think one of the next part was understanding that winning a referendum is about how you get millions of conversations to happen when you can't control the content of those conversations. And understanding, first of all, you can't control the content, and you can't necessarily, put it this way, the biggest barrier is allowing those conversations to happen in the first place. So again, if we think about the angry, polarized world, we realized very early we needed people to have conversations in their home and their workplace and on their streets, because we wanted people to talk about their lives, because we want inclusion to be a who, not a what. And when inclusion became a who, we knew that was our best chance of winning. When it wasn't about some ideological framework, it was about Margaret, who lived up the road.
Yeah.
And that's a different campaign, but that involves building a campaign that allows people to say hello to Margaret and supporting Margaret in a way that she feels confident about having that conversation. And we realized very early that people didn't want to have these conversations because they didn't want to get the language wrong. They didn't want to be part of a confrontational discussion. So instead of taking that final step to being supportive, they were withdrawing from it. And we needed to break that down. We needed to get our base to understand the value of creating space to invite people in to have a conversation. And that without that space, we'd lose, because we couldn't win on the national airwaves. We were going to win at kitchen tables.
Yeah.
So in a way, one of the most important things the campaign had to create was the tone rather than the precise script, but a tone that allowed people to feel confident in their house 2,000 kilometers away from the campaign headquarters to have that discussion on that breakfast.
So how did you do that? I'm really curious. How do you go about creating that space and permission to have those conversations?
I think that one of the hardest parts of this, in a world that's increasingly polarized, you have to be really disciplined about your mission to create that tone, that you are constantly falling back on this idea that, first of all, you're building the capacity of your supporters to understand why, that they have that confidence to spread that then around through that support network, but that all your messaging has to consistently reflect the tone you're hoping to create in the kitchen of someone's house that you can't be in. And that's a hard discipline, because the other side's job is to provoke you. And the other side's job is to get you angry. And they know there's an advantage. If they can make the debate angry, then tomorrow looks scary. What we have to do is create a space where people can actually engage with each other. So it's very hard, is the short answer.
Yeah.
You have to be relentlessly disciplined. Your spokespeople have to be so consistent about not losing their cool, about not deciding to get the extra Twitter followers by lashing out at someone from the other side in that way. And to understand that you are being drawn into that. You're being drawn into, come and get angry. Because then the other side get to say, well, change looks bad. I think there's a really important point about any change campaign. The tone that you set, whether you mean it or not, is the future you're selling. And voters will absorb that whether you know it or not.
That's so true.
Yeah.
So you can have your angry campaign, but people will be hearing that. Most people don't tune in 100% to a campaign. Most people absorb campaigns while they're driving on the radio, or while they're washing the dishes, while they're taking the kids to school, and it comes in bits and bobs. And that framing, that tone, funnily enough, they're more likely to pick the tone up from your campaign
And the words
than
you say.
content. You could be on the radio and your mother could be listening. And of course, your mother thinks you're great no matter what. So you could be on the radio, your mother thinks you're listening, and your mother's listening, and then your mother phones you 20 minutes later to tell you were great. And then you ask your mother, what point did you think was great? And then she'll struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because me enough, what people will remember 20 minutes later is what you sounded like.
Yeah, not the specific words. Tiernan, what role or, how important is sort of humour and positivity in terms of building bridges and connecting with others and helping them see the change that you're advocating from through their eyes?
Well, I mean, positivity is everything. We're selling a positive message.
Yeah.
So this has to feel like a journey people want to take. Because the great thing we have to know about campaigning, always about change, is everyone can ignore us. Everyone can choose to quietly say no. They don't have to have an argument with you. They can just, detach themselves from it. So we're constantly building a campaign that understands this is voluntary, that's enticing people in, that's trying to make connections with people where they are so that they can look forward to the journey. There's a great old Irish phrase that, Irish diplomacy is the ability to tell a man to go to hell in a way that he looks forward to the trip.
That's fab.
I mean, but humour is a key part of this, right? I think.
Humor, positivity, joy, understanding that that's what people are absorbing. There's another dimension, though, I'd add to this. You have a duty to win as a campaign. You also have a duty of care to the people you're representing, or more importantly, that you're campaigning for. So your tone that you set is the tone that the most marginalized person that you are representing will have to live with afterwards. You can run your crash and burn campaign tone, but when we're campaigning for social change in minorities, it's just disastrous because you get to go home and celebrate your win, but that marginalized LGBT person, they have to live with that afterwards. I always remember that, and we say it a lot to our followers, the day after both of those votes, which were huge moments for those societies, both 62 and 63%, the Irish vote and the Australian vote, great victories. But the day after that vote, there were LGBT people in every corner of Ireland and Australia who walked downstairs and had breakfast with a family who voted no.
Yeah.
Who walked to work and sat with a colleague for 10 years who had voted no. So you have a duty to the day after.
Yeah.
And for the marginalized person, but also because there's always more to do.
How do you measure the success of a campaign? I mean, it sounds like a really obvious question, but it can't just be about winning a referendum or an election, right?
No, I mean, like all things, you're measuring it on lots of ways. If the journey to equality is, which it is, it's a long journey for any group of people. First of all, for all people, but for any underrepresented group of people as well. No campaign has ever gone from 0 to 100 for a minority right ever. And all we have to do is look at, women's equality. Sure, that's thousands of years in the making, and we're still not there. So understanding that your campaign is filled with milestones that are either very clear victories, like a referendum, but also milestones that you have to create yourself. Because what you want to do is create a journey that has milestones, wins, and that those wins are used as catalysts to pick up speed to the next win. The hard part of that is the truth of all social change progress is that's incremental. And there's nothing as unsexy as the word incremental. And there is no campaign in the world that ever went, what do we want? Incrementalism. When do we want it? Gradually. It's not a slogan.
Yeah.
But it is how we achieve things. So building your victories as well and understanding you can measure your own victories. You can invent your measures as long as they're effective is really important. So you have your obvious political milestones of a piece of legislation happening. You obviously have also milestones of building broader political support, where you can clearly do that. But you also need to have your other milestones of, the experiences of LGBT people, because, you can change all the laws in the world, but if you're not also changing the culture at the same time and keeping a track of how that culture is being changed, then you're missing the point. I mean, South Africa, unfortunately, is the great example. I always say South Africa has full equality for LGBT people in the constitution, and has one of the highest murder rates of lesbians in the world. So we haven't got the culture to match the laws.
Legislation, yeah.
So it's a blend of both measures. But within it, the thing I'd say is you have to build your victories, because this is a permanent journey. And if you build a permanent journey that doesn't have victories, that's just exhausting.
Yeah.
And people will just check out. And now you're burning through your support base.
What examples do you have that could serve as advice for those trying to change hearts and minds within a working environment?
I would honestly start with what we were saying earlier. People aren't the problem, they're the solution. Your framing has to be about how you get people to see that this is a journey they can take, that they want to take, and that they can be an incredible part of. And I think the corporate world leans very much into compliance. And I understand why that is. It's easy to measure, and it is something that's still required. So you end up having your inclusion training, which is basically your annual training, and here's the 200 things you're not allowed to do. And one of the problems with that framing in isolation is, first of all, it makes some people defensive, because you sit down and explain to people why they're a bad idea. But the other thing it does is it takes advocates and silences them. So what you end up doing is, here's your training, and you have people who are, middle management, who you need to be engines of inclusion and ambassadors for inclusion in the workplace. But they emerge from that training going, oh my God, I didn't realize there was so many things I could do wrong. I don't want to do anything wrong. The easiest way to do nothing wrong is to do nothing.
Yeah.
So in the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think inclusion training is a really good example of it, where we have set out the wrong pathway. And ironically, we silence potential advocates through the inclusion training. So we really have to reimagine that about allowing people to see themselves as the solution. Firstly, I think one of the other great challenges is the corporate world isn't the place where you want to be wrong. And the fear of error then stops people being effective advocates. And this is really hard in the inclusive space, because we're learning new language all the time. We're learning about each other all the time. And we have to give people a break. We have to allow them to get into that journey without feeling they have to be an expert. The bit we said earlier, you don't have to be an expert to be an advocate. In fact, again, you asked a question earlier about what do you define as a win when we're talking about what's winning. I think that's one of the big challenges for inclusion programs. They have misdefined what winning is. Because if winning is making someone an expert, I would argue that's the wrong win.
Yeah.
What I want people to do is become confident and empathetic and inclusive leaders. That's a different skill set than becoming an expert on LGBT and disability and gender rights. You'll learn, which is always a good thing. But if expertise in the corporate sector is considered the entry point, then middle management will walk away. And look, I mean, one of the smaller examples I always use, the disability sector is having this great conversation, which is a totally vibrant conversation to have about, do we say people with disabilities or do we say disabled people? And over time, that has swung back and forth, as people's understanding of language has changed. Perfectly valid and really positive discussion for a sector to have. Now, if the sector can't agree on the terminology, what chance do we have is there for a middle manager to step up into the disability space and try their luck? So that fear of error is crushing out there. And so I think we need to get people to see they don't have to be experts to be advocates. We need to allow people to see they are the solution rather than thinking they have to begin the journey by identifying themselves as the problem. And I think the third one is we need to move them into that proactive space. Because I think what we have done is we have an awful lot of people who I believe most people are in favor of inclusion. I really believe that. But they're not demonstrating it actively because, they just believe that having the value is in of itself a win. But a value you keep in your head is a secret. And it isn't driving change, first of all. And nobody will presume that you have that value in a world where it is safer to presume you don't have that value. So you need to be demonstrating that. That's about taking people on the next step of active inclusion. People confuse the absence of discrimination with the presence of inclusion, or the absence of bad behavior with the presence of good behavior. They're not the same thing.
No, you're right.
You're moving from compliance, which is the older model of how we approach this, which is about the absence of bad behavior and the absence of discrimination, to the more advanced level, which is about active cultural building, which understands the presence of inclusion requires active leadership.
And it's a cruel irony, isn't it? In particular, within the kind of the world of work, the more senior people are, the more potentially powerful they could be in terms of driving change by their role modeling the right behaviors, the more afraid they are of also being seen as wrong as well.
I mean, you got to give people a break. And I know LGBT is a good example because we keep changing the acronym. And I know when I say LGBT, there'll be some people who think I need to say LGBTI. Some people will think I need to say LGBTQI. Some people will say QIA. And I know there will be some people who think I need to say just LGB. So instantly you're getting into this space of going, this can't be this minefield. And we had a great politician in Ireland who was a country politician. And during the Irish referendum, we made the presumption, that he was a rural politician, that he mightn't be a yes voter. And of course, because liberals are very good at presumptions too. We're all equally good at that. And we were wrong. He was a great campaigner for marriage equality. And he was on the local radio, local paper, quite fearless about it, but had, constantly got the language wrong. So he literally spent most of the campaigning for BLTs. So he was saying, I like BLTs. Will you support the BLTs? The BLTs deserve equality. And he's campaigning for sandwiches for about a year. Now, the question for us is, what does winning look like? Is winning allowing him to rock on and be this incredible advocate, knowing that he'll, like all human beings, as long as he's active in any space, will learn more about that space?
Yeah.
Or do we criticize him for getting it wrong? Then he withdraws from the space and his learning opportunities disappear and we've lost an advocate. Now, to me, the answer is obvious, but I think where we go wrong in a more polarized world and a more polarized workplace is we campaign on the latter instead. We think that the error is the most important part to highlight. We think, identifying the blame is the most important part. I just think it's not just a poor journey. It's one that we'll lose if that's the journey we're offering people.
So true.
Thinking about the many campaigns that you've led and been a part of in political and professional and work sense, what are you most proud of and why?
It's hard to pick one. It genuinely is.
Yeah.
I love these campaigns. I love the civil partnership campaign in Ireland because it was in a way the harder one. It was the one that breached the legal principle that gay people should have any relationship recognition. And it was always, again, ironically, the more unsexy one. Marriage is the bigger one, correctly, because it gets closer to full status. But breaking the principle was probably the harder and most important moment that doesn't get the same spotlight. And was probably the more controversial because you have people on your own side who are going, down with incrementalism. And you're going to go, but we need to get here. And we believe this will accelerate it. And we were proved right, but that's still a hard campaign when you have people on your own side who have the same goals as you, really disagreeing with you about the tactical decisions you're making. So I think those ones sometimes can be the unsung ones. I just think there's such joy in what we've delivered. I love those campaigns because underneath it all that the great thing about civil partnership and marriage campaigns, perhaps more than any other campaigns I was involved in, is the winning continues every single day.
Yeah.
Somewhere, someone's getting married. And I will not be invited to that wedding. Thank God. Imagine. But I'll not be invited to that wedding. They don't know who I am. I don't know who they are. And their life is totally transformed.
Yeah.
I remember, after the Irish campaign, people felt quite normal for people in the campaign to feel quite depressed. That was the same in the Australian campaign. Because you're running on adrenaline, this incredible moment. And these are once in a generation campaigns. They're not going to happen every 5 years. And we got you get to a cliff edge, you win, and you wake up the next morning, you go, and it's like, what do I do now? And you could really feel that cliff edge had an impact on campaigners. But that was the point I remember going, look, we had a conversation with so many of them afterwards. And I always just say, every day you get to walk down into your hall and look in the mirror and know that someone's getting married somewhere and that you helped do that and their lives are transformed. And like I say, they're never going to pick the phone up to thank you because they don't know you, and that's okay. You get to look in the mirror every day and smile and know what's happening. And that should give you great strength forever.
Indeed. What a wonderful, wonderful story and a lovely sort of close to our conversation as well. It's been a joy talking to you. I'm so grateful to you for taking the time out of your busy day to spend an hour with us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, it's no bother at all. It's nice to get talking about these things.
I have to say, I'm completely in awe of Tiernan. Everything that he said in that conversation was just gold. I think it is going to be hard to pick a highlight. One of the many takeaways for me is the importance of focusing and never losing sight of the fact that it's the conversations that are had around, the dinner table at home, at the pub with friends, or at the coffee machine with colleagues at work. Those are the conversations that matter and where change happens. And they're also the ones that you can't control. So you don't want those conversations to be confronting, divisive, aggressive. So therefore your campaign shouldn't be any of those things either. I thought that was really interesting. But I think I could go on and on, Jez. What did you take away?
Oh, I mean, so much. What a brilliant man, and what a fascinating conversation. I was particularly struck by this idea of tone, that people will remember how you made them feel, and how you were rather than necessarily what you say. And also the tone that you take into your campaigning is how you will leave people. You'll get that back at you. I thought that was really thought-provoking. The other thing that really struck me is that it's okay for people to get things wrong when they're trying to put into practice a new way of thinking or being or behaving. Tiernan said, you've got to give people a break and allow them to make mistakes. If you don't, they'll never try again. So I thought that was well worth remembering as we think about, the work we do in many ways around sort of changing, getting people to step into new ways of thinking and being and behaving and so on. So what an amazing conversation.
And just before we head off, Jez, we can't forget to spotlight some of the more unremarkable and ordinary moments of life.
I can see that you're yawning, practically snoring. Is it because I am boring? Well, that's life. Being human is being boring.
Yes, it's time for Boring Things About Me, the part of the podcast where we cheer the dull, the mundane and the dreary bits of life, which, if we're honest, make up the majority of our lives. So I can't believe I haven't told you this already.
Oh, dear.
When we were at the hotel in Derby the week before last, getting ready to run Leaders as Storytellers the following day, my laptop power died completely.
You must have been a bit stressed.
You know me too well, Amelia. But I kept my cool. And I asked myself, what would Amelia do in this situation? It was late, so I couldn't phone you to actually ask you. But anyway, some focused Googling. 10 minutes later, I'd ordered a Microsoft Surface Pro power supply from Argos in Sainsbury's to be delivered to the store, just a 5-minute walk from our venue the following day. And I remember saying to myself, Jez, you legend, as I was drifting off to sleep.
So pleased with what you'd achieved.
Yeah, completely. What about you?
Well, mine also actually relates to our time on the road together. And just to paint a bit of a picture for our listeners, Jez and I were travelling from London up to the north of England, staying overnight into the Midlands, where Chargergate occurred.
Yep.
And then, heading over to the west of England and back to London again, doing this 2 weeks running. So we spent a lot of time together on the trains going up and down the country.
Yep.
And I think I've now got my top 3 tips for travelling with Jez, which I don't know whether I'm cheating slightly. My boring things about me is actually about you. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay,
I feel strangely proud.
So tip number 1 is always try and find out where on the platform we need to be standing for optimal efficiency to get onto our carriage.
Yeah.
Because otherwise the transport staff get a bit of an earful and a very stressed Jez coming to approach them to find out that bit of information. So it's doing something on their behalf. Number 2, always keep the tickets for both of you if you're travelling with Jez, so that he can't just go into travelling Jez mode and just leave you packing up your stuff, because he gets stuck at the gates and eventually you can go on together. He can't get very far. And finally, tip number 3, to keep Jez happy whilst on the train, you need to create the right environment. This involves no one playing any music or watching any videos out loud. Ideally a table with nobody else sat on it. And for a last touch, getting Jez a nice cup of tea approximately 20 minutes into the journey with a sweet treat for a bonus smile. So those are my top 3 tips for travelling with you.
Isn't that how everyone travels? Am I really that bad?
I'm only joking, sort of. But yes, it was a good fun 2 weeks. Well, thank you so much for listening to our latest episode of the Being Human podcast.
Please do hit the follow button and leave us a review on whichever platform you're using.
And as always, we would love to hear from you. So if you've got any suggestions on topics that you would like us to explore, or if you think you'd make a brilliant guest, or if you'd like to talk to us about the work we do at Just Add Water, then please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Being Human podcast. Brought to you by Just Add Water. Nurturing individual brilliance, forging collective strength.
Bit nervous.
You'll be fine. It's like riding a bike, Amelia. Bruises and scars all over my face. Say frothy frogs.
Frothy frogs.
Nice. You had to think about that.
I did have
lot,
to think
didn't you?
about that.
Yeah.
I thoroughly enjoyed that.
As Stacey Dooley would say,
Nice.